The clock on the courthouse wall read 11:47 at night, when Lucia Quinn pressed her palm flat against the cold iron door of the most dangerous building in Chicago and pushed it open without knocking. 13 minutes. That was all she had left before midnight, sealed Vladislav Dragomir's fate forever. She had run 17 blocks in the rain, her dark hair plastered against her face, her shoes soaked through, her lungs burning with every breath. She had picked 3 locks, bypassed 2 security checkpoints she absolutely should not have been able to bypass, and lied convincingly to a vamp sentry whose eyes had gone silver with suspicions the moment she stepped into the tortured underground corridor beneath the building the city of Chicago knew as an abandoned municipal archive, and the vampire world knew as the High Tribunal Chamber of the Northern Court. She was 26 years old, human to her bones, and she was walking into a room full of ancient predators to commit what the blood law called an unforgivable interference. She did not particularly care. The chamber was enormous, carved from black limestone that seemed to absorb the light of the iron chandeliers burning above. Rows of stone seats curved in a semicircle, and every one of them was occupied by vampires in formal dark attire, their white hair gleaming, their pale skin luminous as marble under the torchlight. At the center of the chamber floor, wrists bound behind him by chains that glowed faintly with warding runes, stood Vladislav Dragomir. He was tall. That was the first thing anyone noticed about him. He stood 6'3" and carried himself as though the chains were a costume choice rather than a restraint, his posture immaculate, his white hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from the same limestone as the chamber walls. His eyes were the deep, particular crimson of aged wine, and when they found Lucia across the vast floor of the chamber, something in them changed, not fear, not relief. Something far more complicated than either. The presiding magistrate, a vampire called Aldrich Thorne, who looked like a man of 60 in the way that mountains look like hills, slammed his obsidian staff against the floor. "This chamber is closed to human interference," he announced, his voice reverberating off the stone in ways that had nothing to do with acoustics. "Remove the human. I have standing," Lucia said, her voice carrying, despite the fact that her hands were trembling inside her coat pockets. "Article 7 of the Compact of 1887, which your court signed, and which has never been revoked. Any party with direct knowledge of evidence material to the sentence may address the tribunal before the hour of finality." Silence dropped over the chamber like something physical. Vladislav was staring at her with an expression that moved between fury and something raw and unguarded that he was clearly trying to suppress. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low, accented with old-world consonants that his centuries had never entirely smoothed it away. "You should not have confessed to something you did not do," she replied, and she held his gaze long enough that the entire chamber felt the weight of what passed between them. Aldrich Thorne's pale eyes narrowed. "You have 7 minutes to present your evidence, human. Then the sentence stands regardless. 7 minutes." She had run 17 blocks and picked 3 locks for 7 minutes. She pulled the drive from her coat pocket and held it up. "Then let us not waste a single one." 3 weeks earlier, Lucia Quinn had been a forensic data analyst for a firm that did work she could never fully describe at dinner parties. Her official title was Digital Evidence Specialist. Her unofficial skill set included reconstructing deleted files, tracing encrypted communications across 12 layers of anonymization, and finding the one thread in 1,000 that someone desperately needed the world to to never find. She had not known vampires were real until the night Vladislav Dragomir walked through her office door at 2 a.m, sat down across from her desk with the particular ease of someone for whom locked doors were a polite suggestion rather than a barrier, and said, very calmly, "I need you to find out who framed my associate before the evidence destroys him." Lucia had not screamed. She had looked at him for a long moment, taken in the white hair, the crimson eyes, the way the shadows in the room seemed to rearrange themselves slightly in his vicinity, and said, "What is your name, and who sent you to me specifically?" He had looked at her as though she were a puzzle that had just rearranged its own pieces. "Vladislav Dragomir," he said, "and your name was given to me by someone who owes me a considerable debt and who told me you were the best in the city at finding what people try to make disappear." "Your associate," she said. Name, charge, timeline, and that was how it had begun. His associate was a young vampire named Cassiel Vaughan, barely 2 centuries old by vampire reckoning, which apparently made him something like a teenager in terms of social standing, and he had been accused of leaking sealed tribunal records to a human journalist. In the vampire world, this was not a minor infraction. The blood law called it a breach of the veil, the collective agreement by which the vampire courts maintained their concealment from the broader human world, and the sentence for a proven breach of the veil was a permanent binding, a ritual that stripped a vampire of their power and reduced them to something less than either human or vampire, a creature who would live for centuries in a kind of grey, empty half-existence. The evidence against Cassiel was digital, which was why Vladislav had come to Lucia. She had spent 3 days barely sleeping, digging through the data trails that had been presented to the tribunal as proof of Cassiel's guilt. She had found anomalies on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, she was certain. The metadata had been manipulated. The access logs had been reconstructed after the fact. Someone had built a very convincing digital shadow of Cassiel Vaughan committing an act he had never committed, and they had built it well enough that no one inside the tribunal who lacked her specific training would ever have seen the seams. Vladislav had sat across from her in her office on that 3rd morning, listening to her explain what she had found, and she had watched his expression move through something she recognized later as controlled fury, the kind that burns coldest. "Who did it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know it wasn't Cassiel." He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than the words required. "You are certain?" "I am certain." Something settled in him then, something that had been coiled and taut, and he exhaled slowly. "Thank you," he said, and the sincerity in it was so complete and unadorned that it had caught her entirely off guard. She told herself it was the novelty of the situation. She was surrounded by novelties. She had just discovered that vampires were real. Everything was surprising. She kept telling herself that for approximately 4 more days, while she kept digging, and Vladislav kept coming back, always at night, always with the same unsettling quality of presence, as though the air in the room became more charged and more still at the same time when he arrived. He never fed in front of her. He never acted as though her blood were anything other than irrelevant to his purposes, which she was self-aware enough to recognize as something she was grateful for, and also, perversely, slightly curious about. She pushed that thought down firmly. He brought her coffee once, which surprised her enough that she almost spilled it. He had observed that she drank it black from watching her for 3 consecutive nights, and had simply placed a cup from the good place 2 streets over on her desk without comment, as though providing provisions to the human he had hired was a natural thing he did as a matter of course. "You do not have to do that," she said. "You have been awake for 31 hours on my behalf," he said. It seemed appropriate. "Have you been keeping track of how long I've been awake?" "I keep track of things," he said simply, and went back to reading the documents she had printed for him. She drank the coffee and told herself nothing about this meant anything beyond a professional arrangement. On the 5th night, she found the thread she had been looking for. Hidden inside a recursive backup system that had been deliberately obscured, she found the original access logs, unmanipulated, time-stamped, and authenticated, and they pointed not to Cassiel Vaughn, but to a vampire named Erevon Sark, who was, she would learn, a senior member of the tribunal itself. She had called Vladislav immediately. He had arrived in 12 minutes, which later made her wonder where he had been, and when she showed him what she had found, the cold fury that moved through his expression was the most genuinely frightening thing she had seen since he had walked through her door. Not because it was directed at her, but because she understood with sudden clarity what kind of power was contained in that composure, and what it would look like if that composure ever broke. "This will be enough," he said. It had not been enough. Erevon Sark had connections in the tribunal that ran deeper than evidence. He had allies, old debts called in, whispers that the evidence was a fabrication designed to discredit the process, and Vladislav, rather than allow Cassiel Vaughn to face the permanent binding, had done the one thing Lucia had not anticipated. He had confessed. She had found out the same way she found out most things, by digging until she hit the truth. A contact within the tribunal, a low-ranking clerk who had met Lucia once at a data conference, and who, it turned out, was human and frightened, and looking for any excuse to do something decent, had sent her the record of the emergency session. Vladislav had entered the chamber, presented himself before the tribunal, and claimed that it was he who had leaked the sealed records, not Cassiel. He had invented a motive, constructed a plausible account of the breach, and offered himself in Cassiel's place. The tribunal had accepted it. Cassiel Vaughn had been released, and Vladislav Dragomir, Lord of the Northern Court, one of the oldest vampires in North America, had been sentenced to the permanent binding, to be finalized at midnight. Lucia had stared at the record for a very long time. Then she had rebuilt her evidence package with every layer of verification she could construct, encrypted it, copied it to 3 separate drives, and started running. Now she stood in the chamber with 7 minutes on the clock, and she clicked the drive into the tribunal's display system, which she had found was compatible with standard media because vampires, for all their ancient mystique, had pragmatically adopted modern infrastructure decades ago. The evidence presented against Cassiel Vaughn was fabricated, she said, and her voice was steady. I can demonstrate this in 4 layers of verification, each independently sufficient to establish the manipulation. The original, unaltered access logs name Erevon Sark as the individual responsible for the breach. They have been authenticated by 3 independent digital forensic systems and time-stamped prior to any knowledge of the tribunal proceedings. The chamber had gone so quiet she could hear the torches burning. Erevon sat in the 3rd row of the curved stone seats, and even from across the chamber floor, Lucia could see the shift in his expression, the micro-fracture of confidence. Furthermore, she continued, pulling up the comparative analysis on the display, I can demonstrate that the Lord Dragomir's confession is structurally impossible. The technical details he provided in his account of the breach contain 3 specific errors that no individual who actually performed the action would make. He described using a protocol that does not exist in the tribunal's actual system architecture. He named a file path that does not correspond to the actual storage structure, and he placed the breach at a time when the actual original logs show the system was in a maintenance window that would have made the described method physically impossible. Vladislav was watching her. He had not moved. He had not spoken. His crimson eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that she felt across the width of the chamber like a hand on her shoulder, and she could not entirely read what was in them. "She is lying," Erevan Sark said, and his voice was smooth and practiced. "This human was hired by Dragomir. Everything she presents is compromised by that relationship." "Then dispute the data," Lucia said immediately, turning her gaze on him directly. "Not my integrity. Dispute the timestamps. Dispute the authentication chain. Dispute the server logs. If I fabricated this, there will be a seam. Find it." Aldrich Thorne was studying the display with the focused attention of someone who had lived long enough to know that the surface of things was rarely their entirety. "These authentication markers," he said slowly, "they are from systems independent of any vampire infrastructure." "Yes," Lucia said, 3 separate human digital forensic services, none of whom know what they were authenticating or why. Their signatures are verifiable through their public certification registries right now, tonight, if you choose to do so." Another silence. "Longer this time, if what this human presents is accurate," said a voice from the far left of the chamber, a female vampire whose silver hair was coiled in elaborate braids, and whose expression was unreadable. Then a member of this very tribunal constructed evidence to condemn an innocent party and allowed a false confession to stand. "That is precisely what I am presenting," Lucia said. "Yes." The woman, who Lucia would later learn, was Magistrate Veradis Moore, one of the oldest members of the tribunal, and the one whose opinion carried the most weight among the court's older members, rose from her seat. "I move to suspend the finalization pending full verification," she said. The room erupted. Lucia stood in the center of it, her heart hammering as voices multiplied around her, some outraged, some alarmed, some carefully, deliberately neutral. Erevan Sark was on his feet, his composure cracking into something colder and more dangerous. 3 of his allies rose with him. For a moment, the chamber had the precarious, tilting quality of something about to break. Vladislav moved even with his wrists bound by the warded chains. The shift in his presence was immediate. He straightened to his full height and turned his crimson gaze on Erevan Sark with the particular, contained danger of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has just decided that patience is no longer required. "Sit down, Erevan," he said very quietly. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The voice carried the weight of centuries and a court at his back, and Erevan Sark, whatever else he was, understood power clearly enough to recognize it when it looked at him directly. He sat. Aldrich Thorne raised his obsidian staff and brought it down once, sharply. "The finalization is suspended. The chamber will recess for independent verification. Lord Dragomir will remain unbound until the verification is complete." 2 of the tribunal's wardens moved to remove Vladislav's chains. The runes faded. He rolled his wrists once, rubbed the marks the chains had left on his skin with an expression of mild distaste, and then walked across the chamber floor toward Lucia with the same unhurried, absolute certainty with which he seemed to do everything. He stopped in front of her, up close, In the torchlight of the chamber, she could see things she had not fully registered in the dimmer light of her office, the fine detail of his features, the way the crimson of his eyes had a depth to it, layered and complex, like looking into something with real distance behind it. The fact that despite standing in front of a tribunal that had been about to end his existence as he knew it, he had the same quality of controlled, grounded presence that he always had. "You ran," he said. "I did," she agreed. "I did not want you involved in this. I know. That is why you did not tell me." Her voice was even. "Which was a decision that prioritized your sense of protection over my ability to make an informed choice about whether to help someone who had just spent 6 nights helping me understand an entirely new layer of the world I live in." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, more the shape a smile occupies, before a face that has not made many of them in recent centuries remembers how. "You are angry with me," he said. "I am very much not angry with you," she said. "I am frustrated by your methodology. There is a difference." He looked at her for a moment that had weight and texture to it. "You could have been harmed," he said, and the quality of it shifted, quieter, more direct. "If Sark had realized what you possessed before you reached this chamber." "I know," she said. "I was careful. You picked 3 locks, 2.5, she said. The third one was already damaged. The thing that was not quite a smile moved across his face again. "Lucia," he said, and the way he said her name, with the particular weight of someone for whom names were not casual currency, was something she would not be able to stop hearing for a very long time. "Why did you come?" She held his gaze. Around them, the chamber was still in an uproar, voices and motion, and the procedural chaos of a tribunal upended. But between the two of them, it was as though they occupied a pocket of stillness that the noise could not quite reach. "Because you told me the truth," she said. "From the first night you walked into my office, you told me the truth. You did not manipulate me. You did not threaten me. You did not treat me as something to be managed. And when I found what I found and told you it was enough, you trusted my work. You trusted me." She paused. "No one falsely confesses to their own permanent binding for a junior associate out of cruelty. You did it because he mattered to you, and because you believed the evidence would not be enough. You were wrong about the evidence. I needed you to know that." Vladislav looked at her for a long time. "And if the tribunal had barred you at the door," he asked, "if you had not reached this chamber in time, then I would have found another way," she said. "Or I would have tried. I was not going to let them bind you for something you did not do without making every possible effort to prevent it." The quiet that followed was different from the silence of restraint. It was fuller. It had something expanding inside it. "I owe you a debt," he said finally, "by old world code a significant one." "I did not come here to collect a debt," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what makes it significant." The verification took 4 hours. The tribunal reconvened in the early hours of the morning, and by then Aldrich Thorne's expression had settled into the particular gravity of someone who has confronted an uncomfortable truth and decided that truth was non-negotiable, regardless of its cost. Eravon Sark was taken into custody by the tribunal wardens during the recess. He did not go quietly. There was a confrontation in the corridor outside the chamber that Lucia heard from the waiting room where Vladislav had installed her with something approaching insistence. And she thought she heard the particular sound of warding magic, a sharp crack like a circuit breaking, followed by silence. Vladislav came to find her after. He was unhurt, or at least undamaged in any visible way, though she thought his composure had a slightly sharper edge to it than usual. "It is resolved?" she asked. "Sark is in custody. The breach will be investigated fully. Cassiel Vaughan will have his record cleared entirely." He paused. "The tribunal wishes to formally acknowledge your contribution." "I did not need the tribunal to acknowledge anything," she said. "What happens to you?" "I am cleared of any charge." "That is not what I asked. What happens to you, as in what comes next for you, personally?" He studied her with an attention that she had become familiar with over the past weeks and had never quite become comfortable with, because it was not the attention of someone cataloguing her for threat assessment or utility. It was something more like the attention of someone reading very carefully, because they did not want to misunderstand. "I return to my court," he said, "to the responsibilities I was prepared to abandon to protect a young member of my house." He paused. "And I imagine I will think considerably about the fact that a human woman ran 17 blocks in the rain to walk into a tribunal chamber and dismantle a fabricated case in front of 37 vampires with 7 minutes remaining on a sentence that was never mine to carry." 13, she said. "I beg your pardon. It was 13 minutes when I arrived. You had 13 minutes left." He looked at her with that complicated thing in his eyes that she had been watching develop over 3 weeks and had been carefully not naming. "Yes," he said softly, "you used every one of them." She looked at him standing in the waiting room of a tribunal chamber beneath the city of Chicago at 4 in the morning, his white hair slightly disordered for the first time she had ever seen it, the marks of the chain still faintly visible on his wrists, and she thought about all the things she had been not naming for 3 weeks. "I would like to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "Why did you trust me? From the very first to my office, and you told me the truth immediately. You did not test me or ease into it or manage how much I knew. You told me vampires were real and that you needed my help, and you trusted that I would handle both of those things. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the person who recommended you wanted me that you were someone who treated the truth as a fixed point, even when it was inconvenient," he said. "And because when I sat across from you and told you what I needed, you asked for the name and the charge and the timeline. Not whether I was real, not how it was possible, not whether you were safe." Something in his expression was very still and very direct. "You treated the task as the task. You treated me as someone who had come to you with a problem. That is rarer than you know." She thought about that. It seemed like the practical response. It was, he agreed. It was also something more than that. The silence between them had warmth in it now. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. "Something that is not about the case or the tribunal or the debt I owe you." She waited. "In the chamber," he said, and his voice was lower now, more careful with each word. "When you walked through that door, I experienced something I have not experienced in a very long time." "What was that?" "Fear," he said. "Not for myself. I was prepared for what was coming. But when I saw you walk into a chamber full of my kind with a drive in your hand and a case to make, I understood for the first time in a considerable number of years that there was something I could lose that I was not prepared to lose." The breath she drew was not entirely steady. "Vladislav," she said. "I am aware," he said quietly, "that this is not simple. I am aware of what I am and what you are, and the distance between those two things. I am not asking for anything. I am simply, for the first time in recent memory, choosing to tell the truth about something that has nothing to do with a case." She crossed the room. She reached up and touched the mark on his wrist, where the chain had been, her fingers light on the skin there, and she felt him go very still, in the way that she had learned was his version of something profound happening beneath the controlled surface. I drove 6 blocks out of my way 3 nights ago to bring you coffee from the place you brought it from the first time, she said. I told myself it was because I was in the area. I was not in the area. He looked at her hand on his wrist, then he looked at her face. The place with the green awning, he said. The place with the green awning, she confirmed, very slowly, as though he were doing something that required the same care as disarming something dangerous. He turned his wrist beneath her hand and held it, instead, his fingers closing around hers, his palm cool and steady and utterly deliberate. I would very much like to see you again, he said. Outside of a crisis, outside of a tribunal, outside of anything that requires something from either of us beyond the choice to be in the same room. Yes, she said, I would like that too. He exhaled slowly. The expression that had been living behind his composure for 3 weeks settled finally into something she could fully read. He was not smiling yet. But the architecture of it was there, in the way his eyes softened and the line of his shoulders changed, and she thought that when he did smile, properly and fully, it was going to be something worth waiting for. They left the tribunal chamber as the first grey light before dawn was beginning to press against the edges of the night. Vladislav guided her through the underground corridors with hand at the small of her back that was both protective and careful, and she let him because it did not feel like management or control. It felt like someone who had spent a very long time keeping track of all possible threats, deciding that keeping her close was the preference he had stopped pretending, was purely professional. Cassiel Vaughan met them in the corridor outside the main exit. He was young by vampire standards, which meant he looked approximately 22 in human terms, with dark, streaked white hair and eyes that were currently red-rimmed in a way that suggested he had been through something considerable. He stopped when he saw Lucia and stared at her with an expression of complete and uncomplicated awe. You are the human, he said. I am a human, she said. Lucia Quinn. You destroyed their case, he said, in 7 minutes in front of Aldrich Thorne. I had good evidence, she said. She had very good evidence, Vladislav agreed. Cassiel pulled his gaze from Lucia with visible effort and looked at his lord. You confessed, he said. His voice broke slightly on it. You were going to let them bind you. You were innocent, Vladislav said. The calculation was not complicated. It was complicated, Cassiel said, and there was something fierce and young and honest in the way he said it. It was the most complicated thing anyone has ever done for me, and I did not know how to stop it, and now I do not know how to. He stopped, collected himself, the vampire composure reasserting itself over the very human emotion beneath it. Thank you, he said finally to Vladislav, and then turned to Lucia. And thank you, you did not have to come. You were not part of this. Vladislav helped me understand the world more clearly, she said. Returning the favor seemed reasonable. Cassiel's looked between them with the particular perception of someone who is young enough to not yet have learned to conceal what they notice. I will leave you both, he said, and there was the shadow of something warm in it. I suspect you have things to discuss. He disappeared down the corridor with the efficient speed of someone who has just decided. Discretion is the better part of everything. Vladislav watched him go. He is going to be impossible for the next several decades, he said. He is going to be wonderful, Lucia said. Vladislav turned to look at her. The grey light was reaching them now. filtered through the ventilation high in the corridor walls, pale and early. "I need to be underground before true dawn," he said, "which gives us approximately 40 minutes. "Then let us not waste them standing in a corridor," she said. They found a room deeper in the building, a small antechamber off the main passage that had a narrow couch and a lamp, and the atmosphere of a place that had been used for quiet conversations for longer than the building above it had existed. Lucia sat. Vladislav sat beside her, closer than he had ever chosen to sit in her office, close enough that the cool air he seemed to carry with him was tangible. And it was not unpleasant. It was distinctive. It was him. "Tell me something," she said. "Something that is not about the case. Something you would not normally volunteer." He looked at the lamp for a moment. "I have not slept in the way you mean the word for longer than I can precisely recall," he said. "I enter a resting state. It is not the same. I sometimes wonder what dreaming is actually like. Not in the abstract, but as an experience. I can no longer remember the last time I had one." She looked at him. "How long have you been a vampire?" "Long enough that the question requires me to do arithmetic," he said. "Somewhere beyond 5 centuries. The precise number becomes less important when the decades cease to feel distinct." "Does it bother you?" she asked. "The length of it?" "There are periods it does and periods it does not," he said. "It has bothered me less in recent weeks than it has in some time." She felt the warmth of that move through her. "Tell me something else," she said. "I have a garden," he said, "in the residence beneath the court. Nothing elaborate. A small space with a glass ceiling that filters the light so I can sit in it during the day if I choose the right hours. I grow things in it, herbs mostly, things with distinctive smells. It is the most human thing I do, I think." She smiled. "What do you grow, Rosemary?" he said. "Thyme. Something that was sold to me as lavender, but behaves like nothing I have grown before or since. It grows at angles that do not correspond to the available light. I keep it anyway." "Obstinate lavender," she said. "Obstinate lavender," he agreed. "It seemed appropriate somehow, because you kept it anyway, despite not understanding it." He turned and looked at her with the full weight of those crimson eyes. "Yes," he said. "Something like that." She held his gaze. The 40 minutes passed and did not feel long enough, which told her something she had already known but appreciated having confirmed. They talked about the garden, and about her work, and about the city as it looked from below, from the network of old passages and chambers that the vampire courts had built and rebuilt over the centuries underneath Chicago's changing bones. He told her what the city had looked like 200 years ago, not as a historical account, but as a memory, personal and specific. And she listened with the same attention she brought to evidence, not because she was cataloguing facts, but because she found that she wanted to know everything he was willing to tell her. When the light in the ventilation shafts began to shift in color from gray to the first pale yellow that signaled true dawn was close, he rose. "I should go," he said. She rose too. They stood in the small antechamber, and the moment had the particular quality of something that was about to become a decision. He lifted his hand and touched her face very lightly, his knuckle against her cheek, slow and deliberate and careful, the way he had held her hand in the waiting room. "Thank you," he said, "for the evidence, for the run, for the 13 minutes. He paused. "For the coffee," she laughed softly, genuinely. "Thank you for the first one," she said, "and for telling me the truth." He lowered his hand. He was looking at her with everything he had stopped pretending was not there. "I will find you," he said, "when the night is right, not for a case. For the other thing, I will be findable, she said. I will leave the door unlocked. Something moved across his face that was fully, completely a smile, and she had been right. It was something worth waiting for. Quiet and warm and entirely real in a face that had spent centuries learning the architecture of composure, he left. She stood in the antechamber for a moment, with the warmth of it still in the room, and then collected her coat and her drive, and made her way back up through the building into a morning that was cold and clear, and smelled like rain and Chicago in October. And she walked the 17 blocks back to her office, because she did not want to take a cab. She wanted to feel the morning. The weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing that mattered ever was. The tribunal's investigation into Erevon Sark moved at the pace of old institutions confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves, which was thorough and meticulous, and slower than Lucia, who processed information at the speed of someone who had spent a decade in digital forensics, found entirely comfortable. Vladislav managed the politics of it with the particular skill of someone who had been navigating court hierarchies since before the city above them had been called Chicago, and he kept her informed at every step, not because she was involved officially, but because he had apparently decided that telling her the truth was now a settled habit he had no intention of revising. He came to her office 3 nights after the tribunal, not for a case. He brought the coffee again, and this time she had her own waiting, and he looked at the 2 cups on the desk with the expression of someone making a note. They talked for 4 hours about nothing that required either of them, and everything that mattered anyway. On the 5th night, he took her underground, not to the tribunal chamber, but to the court itself, the residence beneath the northern part of the city, where the court of the Northern Lord had been established for nearly a century. It was not what she had expected, which had been something between a medieval castle and a Gothic mansion rendered in subterranean limestone. It was that, in its bones, in the architecture, and the proportions, and the stone-carved arches, but it was also full of books and light, carefully designed artificial light that rendered the underground spaces warm rather than cold, and it smelled like old paper and wood smoke, and, under everything else, rosemary. He showed her the garden. It was exactly what he had described. A small space with a glass ceiling through which she could see the city's lights diffused into something softer, and it was full of things growing in quiet, improbable abundance. The lavender grew at angles. She stood in front of it for a long time. "You were right," she said. "It does not behave like lavender." "It never has," he said, "not once in 11 years. And you kept it, obviously," he said. She turned to look at him in the garden light, and thought that this was a thing she wanted to keep seeing. This specifically. Him in this room with these growing things and the city lights coming through the glass above them. "Vladislav," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I think I am in love with you," she said. "I want to say it clearly, because I believe in the value of direct communication, and because I would rather know, sooner than later, whether that is something that can be possible between us." He looked at her for one long, full, complete moment. Then he crossed the garden in 3 steps and took her face in both hands, his thumbs at her cheekbones, and he kissed her in the way that someone kisses when they have been very carefully not doing something for a very long time and have finally decided that stopping was never going to become easier. It was the most deliberate kiss she had ever experienced, present and entire and utterly without hesitation, and when it ended, she understood that it was not the last one. "I have been in love with you," he said, very close, his voice lower than she had heard it, "since you asked me for the name and the charge and the timeline without asking whether I was real." She pressed her forehead against his jaw. "That was the first night," she said. "Yes," he said. "It has been a very long 3 weeks." She laughed into his shoulder, and she felt him exhale against her hair, slow and deep, the tension of centuries briefly absent. It was not simple after that either, because the world they inhabited, both his world and hers, had textures and complications and old-world codes that did not bend easily for anything, including feelings. The tribunal made formal note of Lucia Quinn's intervention in the Sark case, which in practical terms meant that her name was now known inside the vampire court infrastructure, which was a thing that carried both protection and exposure in proportions that required careful management. Vladislav managed it with the focused precision that she had come to understand was his primary mode, and he did it transparently, explaining each decision and its reasoning, and offering her, always, the full picture rather than the managed version. Cassiel Vaughan, whose record had been cleared, attached himself to Lucia with the particular loyalty of someone who has been saved twice over, once by a Lord's sacrifice and once by a human sprint through the rain, and he turned out to be genuinely, entertainingly good company. He had been alive for 2 centuries and spent most of it fascinated by technology, which meant he and Lucia had conversations about digital architecture that went places she had not anticipated and found unexpectedly delightful. Magistrate Veradis Moore, who had moved to suspend the finalization, requested a meeting with Lucia 3 weeks after the tribunal. Lucia went, which Vladislav was not entirely comfortable with, but accepted, because she was capable of navigating an interview with a very old vampire, and they both knew it. Veradis Moore, it turned out, was interested in Lucia's forensic methodology in a professional capacity. The tribunal, she explained, with the careful precision of someone raising a significant topic with appropriate caution, had discovered during the Sark investigation that its digital evidence evaluation processes had significant vulnerabilities. She was wondering whether Lucia Quinn might be interested in consulting. Lucia had looked at the very old magistrate across a table in an underground meeting room and said, "Send me the scope and the terms in writing, and I will consider it." Veradis Moore had smiled for the first time, something narrow and genuine and slightly amused. "You are exactly what I was told," she said. "I hope that is a compliment," Lucia said. "In my experience," Veradis Moore said, "it is the highest compliment the tribunal offers anyone." She consulted. It became a formal arrangement within 2 months, careful in its structure, explicit in its terms, and genuinely useful in ways she found satisfying. She retained her human clients, her human life, her apartment, and her coffee from the place with the green awning. She added a second dimension that most of the people she had grown up with could not have imagined. She learned, over time, more about Vladislav's world than she had expected to absorb. The blood laws, which were not monolithic, but were instead a layered system of codes that had evolved over centuries and were still being contested and revised by courts that moved slowly but did eventually move. The old world hierarchies, which were rigid in form and pragmatic in practice, which meant that a lord of the Northern Court, bringing a human forensic specialist into his professional orbit, was unusual and noted, but not, ultimately, without precedent. The politics, which were exhausting and fascinating, and which he navigated with a skill that she found genuinely impressive and told him so, which made him look at her with the particular expression that meant something she had done or said had quietly delighted him. He taught her the court etiquette she needed to move in his world safely. She showed him how she thought through evidence, not because he could not think, but because the particular way she approached reconstruction, lateral and iterative and willing to be wrong repeatedly in the interest of being right eventually, was something he told her he found genuinely useful. They argued, sometimes, cleanly and specifically about concrete things, about decisions she thought were too cautious or strategies she thought were too blunt. And they listened to each other when they argued, and they revised their thinking when the argument warranted it, and both of those things, the arguing and the listening, felt like the same language. 6 months after the night she ran 17 blocks in the rain, he asked her something in the garden. They were sitting on the low stone bench near the obstinate lavender, which was still growing at its improbable angles and still smelling exactly like lavender despite everything, and he was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. "There are things I cannot offer you," he said. "I want to be clear about them," she said. "The daylight world," he said. "Full access to it in the way you have always had. I can give you nights. I can give you this." He gestured at the garden, at the court beyond it. "I cannot walk beside you in the afternoon. I cannot meet you for lunch. There are limitations that are structural and permanent." She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for 6 months, because she was someone who thought through things completely, and she had run every version of it that she could construct. "There are things I cannot offer you either," she said. "I do not intend to be turned. I know that is something you understand and respect, and I want to say clearly that it is not because I am afraid of you or because I think less of what you are. It is because I am human, and that is something I am genuinely, completely. My mortality is part of me, and I am not trying to escape it." "I know," he said. "I have never wanted you to be anything other than what you are." "Then you understand that you will outlive me," she said steadily, "by a considerable margin. That is also a structural reality." "Yes," he said. "I have thought about it more than I have thought about almost anything else." And he looked at the lavender for a moment. "And I have decided," he said quietly, "that however long I have with you is worth more to me than any amount of time without you. That the mathematics of grief that comes later does not make the now worthless. That I am old enough to understand that nothing permanent is as valuable as something real." He turned to her. "And that I am tired of making calculations about living and very interested in simply living." She felt the weight and meaning of that settle through her. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly right." He took her hands in both of his. "I would like this to be the thing it already is," he said. "As a form between us as a settled thing. It already is the thing it already is," she said. "You do not need to formalize it with me, I am aware," he said, and something in his expression was warm and wry and completely unguarded. "I find that I want to anyway. I have spent a very long time being formal, at a distance from things that mattered. I would like to try being deliberate and close for once." She moved closer to him on the bench, her shoulder against his, and he turned slightly to rest his cheek against her hair, and the lavender grew at its impossible angle in the filtered city light above them. And it was quiet and warm and completely true. There was a complication in the 8th month, because there was always a complication, and the world they moved between did not offer long, uninterrupted stretches of uncomplicated things. A faction within the Southern Court, a vampire network that operated out of New Orleans and ran along the Gulf Coast as far as Miami, raised a formal objection to the tribunal arrangement. Their argument was old world in its framing and political in its actual motivation, that allowing a human permanent access to tribunal infrastructure created an unacceptable breach of the veil, that Lucia Quinn's continued involvement compromised court security, and that the Northern Lord's obvious personal connection to the human in question indicated a conflict of interest that should disqualify him from his position on the Tribunal Advisory Council. The hearing was set for a court convened in neutral territory, which in practice meant a building in Atlanta that looked like a private law firm on the outside and was a formal court chamber on the inside. Lucia and Vladislav drove to Atlanta together, which took them through the night in a manner that suited one of them considerably better than the other, and which gave them approximately 11 hours of interstate, highway, and conversation. Somewhere in Tennessee, after the conversation had moved through court politics and her consulting arrangement and Cassiel's latest project, which involved an attempt to cross-reference historical tribunal records with modern digital databases in a way that Cassiel was convinced would revolutionize court archiving, and which Vladislav thought would produce a fascinating disaster, Lucia said. "What happens if they rule against the arrangement?" "They will not," he said, "but if they do." He drove for a moment in the particular silence that meant he was deciding how fully to answer. "If they rule against the consulting arrangement, we restructure it," he said. "The work you do for the tribunal is valuable enough that Veradis Moore will argue for it, with weight I cannot entirely predict. If they rule against your presence in court infrastructure entirely, which is the more aggressive interpretation of the objection, then I will contest it at the highest available level. And if they rule that your connection to me creates a disqualifying conflict of interest," he glanced at her briefly, "then I will remove myself from the advisory council," he said. "I have held that position for 40 years. I can hold other positions. I cannot hold other choices." The way he said it was so completely, simply certain that she felt it in her chest. "You do not have to sacrifice the position for me," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not a sacrifice. That is a preference clearly expressed. You are not something I am being forced to choose. You are the thing I am choosing." She looked at the highway, stretching ahead of them in the dark, and thought that 5 centuries of living had apparently produced someone who understood the difference between sacrifice and choice better than most people she had encountered in 26 years of being human. "You are going to make me cry in your car," she said. "It is a very old car," he said. "It has seen worse." She laughed, and he reached across the console and took her hand on the armrest, and they drove through Tennessee in the dark. The hearing in Atlanta lasted 2 days. Lucia testified clearly and in full about the nature and structure of her consulting arrangement with the tribunal, and she did it with the same controlled precision she brought to evidence presentation, which was not coincidence. She had prepared. She knew her own case. Veradis Moore argued with the force of someone who had been attending courts before the Southern faction's objectors had been born, which, in practical terms, meant she dismantled their arguments, one by one, with the patience and thoroughness of someone who had time on her side in the most literal possible sense. Vladislav made a statement that was brief and direct and exactly enough. He did not apologize for his connection to Lucia Quinn. He did not minimize it or frame it as irrelevant. He presented it as a known fact and then presented the argument that the value she brought to the tribunal's forensic infrastructure was independent of his connection to her, which was true, and that the tribunal was capable of evaluating evidence and expertise on its merit, which was also true, and that if the Southern Court's actual concern was court security, it should be directing its attention toward the institutional failures that had allowed Erevan Sark to construct a fabricated evidence trail unchecked for 18 months, rather than toward the human who had uncovered it. The objection was ruled insufficient. The consulting arrangement was formally ratified with an expanded scope. On the drive home, Lucia sat with her head back and her eyes closed while the miles went by. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said, satisfied. "Mostly tired." "Sleep," he said. "I will drive." "That is what you have been doing for 11 hours. I do not require what you require," he said. "Sleep, Lucia. You are very bossy," she said without heat. "I am protective and organized," he said. "There is a distinction." She smiled with her eyes closed. "You are going to claim that distinction until the end of time." "I have time," he said. "Yes." She slept. When she woke, it was past 3 in the morning, and they were somewhere in Kentucky. And Vladislav was driving in the particular settled quiet of someone who is entirely comfortable with the silence, and she looked at him in the dashboard light, at his profile and his white hair and his hands on the wheel, and she felt something she had been feeling for months now, and had stopped trying to analyze, because some things were more usefully felt than analyzed. "I have been thinking," she said. He glanced at her. "You are always thinking." "I have been thinking about what you said in the garden," she said. "About however long you have with me being worth more than any amount of time without me." "Yes," he said. "I feel the same way," she said. "I want to say that clearly, not because it changes the math of it. It does not change the math, but because you have been carrying the weight of that calculation, and I want you to know that I am carrying it with you, that you are not the only one who looked at the shape of this and chose it anyway." He was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, and the way he said it had the same quality as the first time he had said it to her, sincere and direct, and completely hand unadorned. She reached over and touched his hand on the wheel, and he turned it briefly to hold hers. They arrived back in Chicago as the sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, and he drove beneath the court through the private entrance, and they sat in the underground car park for a moment before getting out because neither of them moved immediately. "Come inside," he said. She did. The court was quiet at that hour, the residential levels still and dark, and he walked her through it with the ease of someone in his own home, past the library and the long corridor that smelled like old wood and something metallic and faintly sweet that she had learned was a particular kind of preservative used on the stone, and into the garden. The obstinate lavender was silver in the artificial light. They stood in the garden, and she turned to him and he looked at her with his heart entirely visible in his face, which she understood cost him something, because a vampire lord who lived in courts did not become accustomed to having his heart visible, and she moved into his arms. He held her with the same deliberate, absolute quality that characterized everything he did. Not tightly, not with the desperation of someone afraid to let go, with the security of someone who has decided that this is where they are standing and is entirely at peace with that decision. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I love you," a pause. "I have loved you since the first night, and I will love you for the entire rest of the time I have, which is considerably longer than most people are offered. She held him, and the garden was quiet, and the lavender grew at its impossible angle, and everything was exactly what it was. There is a particular quality to a life that is made rather than inherited, and Lucia Quinn was someone who had always known how to make things. In the months that followed the Atlanta hearing, she made something specific and deliberate from the material she had, which included a consulting practice that was now formally recognized by the Northern Court's tribunal infrastructure, a relationship with a 5-century-old vampire lord who brought her coffee from the place with the green awning and grew things in a garden beneath the city, a friendship with Cassiel Vaughan that occupied a register somewhere between younger sibling and excitable colleague, and the ongoing project of learning what it meant to move between two worlds without losing herself in either. She kept her apartment. She kept her human clients, the ones who needed someone who could find what had been hidden in the digital architecture of ordinary life. She kept her mornings, which were hers alone, coffee and daylight, and the city going about its business, and she kept her evenings, which increasingly began in the underground of the Northern Court, and extended as late as the work, or the conversation, or the particular pleasure of sitting in the garden reading, while Vladislav read across from her required. She got to know the court in the way you get to know a place when you are genuinely part of it rather than visiting. She learned who was important and who pretended to be important, and how those two populations were distributed in the vampire hierarchy with the same analytical attention she brought to everything. She learned that Vladislav's court was known within the vampire world for a particular quality of governance. Not the most powerful, not the oldest, but the most consistently principled, which was less common than she might have expected, and more admired than it was openly acknowledged. She asked him once why that was the reputation, how he had built it. He thought about it for a while before answering. "I lost someone, a very long time ago," he said, "to a court decision that was made on the basis of politics rather than truth. I spent a long time being angry about it, and then I spent a very long time deciding what kind of lord I was going to be instead." He paused. "I decided I was going to be the kind who made decisions on the basis of what was actually true. It is not always convenient. It is often complicated. It has occasionally cost me alliances I would have preferred to keep. But I can look at any decision I have made and tell you exactly why I made it. And that is worth more to me than being comfortable." She had understood, hearing that, something about why he had been able to trust her from the first night. She was someone who treated the truth as a fixed point, even when it was inconvenient. He had recognized himself in that, or recognized the thing he had decided to be. Cassiel's archiving project turned out to be neither a revolution nor a fascinating disaster, but something genuinely useful and slightly unexpected, which was probably the best possible outcome. He produced a cross-referenced index of historical tribunal decisions that was dense and meticulous, and more practically valuable than anyone had anticipated, and Veradismore had looked at the finished product with an expression of surprised approval that Cassiel clearly treasured. He showed it to Lucia with the pride of someone who has built something real. "This is excellent," she told him honestly. "You should present it to the full tribunal." "Vladislav said the same thing," Cassiel said, slightly suspiciously, as though he was not entirely sure whether they were managing him. "We are both right," she said. "That is allowed to happen." He presented it. The tribunal received it well. He was, as a consequence, offered a research position that gave him formal standing in the court infrastructure in a way that 2 centuries of general service had not quite solidified, and he took it with the particular, quiet delight of someone who has been looking for a place to be useful and has just found it. Vladislav told her about Cassiel's appointment on a Thursday evening in the garden, and she felt genuine, uncomplicated happiness for it that was as warm as anything she had felt in years. "You should take some credit," she said. "You protected him. That is why he was there to do this." "He earned it," Vladislav said. "Both things can be true," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued by now, the one that lived at the intersection of amusement and something deeper. "Yes," he said, "they can." On the anniversary of the night she ran 17 blocks in the rain, he asked her to come to the garden earlier than usual. She arrived to find that the obstinate lavender had, for the first time in 11 years, grown straight up, aligned perfectly with the available light, tall and full, and exactly what it was supposed to be. She stared at it for a long time. "That is not possible," she said. "Evidently it is," he said from behind her. She turned. He was standing at the center of the garden with a look on his face that was entirely open and clear and entirely certain, and he was holding something small, a ring, simple gold set with a dark stone that was the same particular deep crimson as his eyes. "I know we have discussed all of the complications," he said, "the mathematics and the structure and the things that cannot be different because they are what they are. I know all of that is true, and I am not asking you to forget any of it." He paused. "I am asking whether you would like to be beside me for the portion of this that can be shared. Whether you would like to make it the thing it already is, in the most permanent form available." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the first night and the 17 blocks and the 13 minutes and the coffee from the place with the green awning and the obstinate lavender that had spent 11 years growing sideways and had apparently decided this morning that it was ready to grow straight. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger with the same deliberate absolute care that he brought to everything, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him in the middle of the garden, under the glass ceiling through which the filtered city light fell, and the lavender was straight and true and smelled exactly as it should. Cassiel, who had apparently known and had been watching from the doorway, for reasons that Lucia would later describe as constituting a significant invasion of privacy, and which she was entirely forgiving him for, made a sound that was undignified and joyful and entirely vampire in its particular frequency, and then disappeared back down the corridor, making no attempt whatsoever to be quiet about it. "He is going to be impossible," Vladislav said against her hair. "He already is," she said. "We love him anyway." He held her close in the garden, in the underground of the city that had been his court for nearly a century, and she pressed her palm against his chest and felt the steady beat there, slower than human, but present. "Certain?" he asked. "That I am exactly where I want to be," she said. "Yes," he said softly. "So am I." The years that followed were full in the way that a life can be full when it is genuinely inhabited. There were more hearings and more cases and more court politics, and Lucia navigated all of it with the same focused, lateral intelligence she brought to everything, and the tribunal came to regard her with the particular respect reserved for someone whose work speaks so clearly for itself that the surrounding complications become irrelevant. Vladislav were becoming Lucia would have called a mentor if she had expected that word to eventually apply to a vampire of indeterminate centuries. But she used it anyway, because it was accurate. Vladislav governed his court with the same principled precision he always had, and she was part of it, not as an extension of him, but as herself. Lucia Quinn, who had once sprinted 17 blocks through Chicago rain and picked 2.5 locks and told the truth in front of 37 vampires with 7 minutes to spare. She was known for that. She was known for the drive in her hand and the steady voice and the timestamps that had held. She was known for choosing to come. There were mornings she still walked in the daylight alone, because that was hers, and she kept it, and there were evenings she arrived in the court to find coffee already on the desk. From the place with the green awning and Vladislav, reading with the particular settled quality of someone who has everything he needs in the room. There were nights they spent in the garden, with the lavender standing perfectly straight and the city lights diffused above them, and nothing required of either of them, beyond the simple fact of being there. There were harder things, too. The weight of difference held honestly between them, the moments that required conversation rather than feeling, clear-eyed and direct, the kind that maintained trust when the distance between two worlds pressed in. She never asked him to pretend the distance was not there. He never asked her to cross it in a direction she had not chosen. They maintained the truth of it, the way he had always maintained truth, as the fixed point around which everything else could be arranged. Cassiel, in a moment of genuine feeling that he covered immediately, with an elaborate layer of casual commentary, told her once that the court was different since she had been part of it. "Lighter," he said, and then looked embarrassed about the word, as though he had revealed something too honestly. "Lighter is a good word," she told him. "I am going back to my archives," he said, and went. She smiled at his retreating back and felt the warmth of it, the uncomplicated, genuine warmth of a life that had chosen itself, and was choosing itself still, on an ordinary evening near the beginning of a new year. Lucia sat in the garden with her coffee and a stack of materials that needed reviewing, and the quiet companionship of the man she loved reading across from her, and she looked up at the glass ceiling, and the city lights coming through it, and thought about the night she had run through the rain with a drive in her hand and 13 minutes left. She had not known then what she was running toward. She had known what she was running to prevent, and that was enough. That had always been enough for her, a clear task and the capacity to do it and the choice to try. She had not known she was also running toward a garden underground and lavender that grew sideways, and a vampire lord who would one day look at her in the middle of a tribunal chamber as though she were the most consequential thing in the room. She was glad she had not known. It would have been a lot to hold while picking locks. Vladislav looked up from his reading, as though he had felt her attention, which she had long since accepted as a genuine phenomenon rather than a convenient fiction. "All right?" he asked. "Perfect," she said. "I was just thinking about the night I ran." Something moved in his expression, warm and layered. "You always say it that way. The night I ran." "That is what it was," she said. "It was the night I nearly lost something I did not know yet that I had," he said. She looked at him across the garden, with the lavender between them and the city above them, and everything that had happened and everything still to come arranged around this moment like rooms off a hallway. "You did not lose it," she said. "No," he said, "because you ran." She smiled. He returned it, fully, warmly, completely. The smile that had been worth every one of those 17 blocks. "Come and sit with me," he said. She gathered her things and moved across the garden, and sat beside him on the stone bench close enough that his arm came around her shoulders in the quiet, habitual way of people who have spent enough time together for the gesture to be natural, and she settled against him. The lavender was straight and still. The city moved above them, as it always had and would. And here, in the underground of a court that ran on old-world codes and ancient vows and the careful truth of things, a human woman and a vampire lord were simply, completely, entirely at home, and the night outside was long, and they had every minute of it, and they used them all.